In the dark of May 1061, a small fleet of transport vessels stealthily separated from the larger fleet, crossing the Straits of Messina, setting sail from Reggio on the Italian mainland. The Mediterranean's waves gently caressed the hulls of these ships, which were under the command of Duke Robert Guiscard of Apulia, carrying thousands of Norman warriors. These Normans had long coveted Sicily, and now, after glorious victories in the 1050s, they were legitimized by the Pope in Rome, vying to reclaim this land with a 2-century history from the Arab Emirate. This ancient land, with its rugged mountains, valleys, and crystal-clear blue seas, was coveted. At dawn, the Arab and Berber defenders on the coast saw the main fleet still busily preparing for an invasion, with Lombard stable boys tending to fierce war horses, Greek mariners hoisting sails, and Norman knights sharpening swords and joking on deck, everything appearing normal. Meanwhile, on the shore, hidden by sand dunes and tall grasses, the figures on the small boats moved quickly and cautiously, well acquainted with the winding paths and twisting gullies of the coastline, having raided the area twice in the past year. Among them might have been veterans from the last Christian attempt to recapture the island under the command of Byzantine General George Maniakes in 1040. Over the 2 decades since that attack, much had changed. Those seasoned veterans who had fought as mercenaries under William Iron Arm for the Emperor were now led by new Norman leaders who had asserted themselves, supplanting the Byzantines as the foremost power in the region, winning legitimacy from the Pope through cunning political maneuvers. And now, having tested the waters, they were determined to try their luck where the Byzantines had failed. Suddenly, an elite force of Norman warriors emerged from the sands, charging straight for the provincial capital of Messina. The defenders, believing the Norman invasion force was still blockaded at sea, unable to land, were completely unprepared for the attack. By sunset, the city had fallen into Norman hands. A few days later, the commander of the main fleet, Robert Guiscard, arrived with his army, intent on clearing out any remaining resistance. If the enemy surrendered and submitted, the Normans guaranteed their safety and even allowed them to continue practicing their own religions. If they chose to resist, they would face merciless retribution. The capture of Messina marked the beginning of one of the most glorious conquests in Norman history. For them, it was a daring adventure to strike out and seize new lands. For the Arabs, it was the first act in a centuries-long struggle for supremacy in the Eastern Mediterranean, a conflict that would only truly end in the Age of Empires. The prelude of the Crusades had been drawn. The mastermind and leader of this bold raid was the youngest of the Hauteville brothers, Roger, 16 years younger than Guiscard, more reserved, thoughtful, and less aggressive than his brothers. He might not have seemed the obvious choice for leadership, but he ultimately became the one to establish a dynasty in the region that would endure longer than any other, eventually forging one of the most prosperous kingdoms in all of Europe. This is the story of Roger de Hauteville, known as the Father of Kings. In his later years, he honored the great Count and the magnificent epic of the Norman conquest of Sicily. In the mid-1050s, in the Frankish vassal duchy of Normandy, a young knight named Roger met a young heiress named Judith. The two quickly fell in love, but Roger, being a landless son, had no future in Normandy, while Judith was the daughter of one of Duke William's closest advisors. Judith's father, William Devereux, had no regard for the young knight, unless he could provide a substantial dowry in Normandy. Apart from a career in the church, or the remote possibility of eventually inheriting his father's meager estate, Roger had no options. So he followed in his brother's footsteps, setting out with a small band of warriors to Italy, a popular destination for landless Norman knights seeking glory. Fortunately for Roger, he just so happened to be the younger brother of the famous mercenary commanders William Iron Arm and Robert Guiscard, two ruthless warlords who had been active in Italy for decades. Along with several other sons of Tancred and other family members, Roger and his contemporaries could not have foreseen that by traveling to Italy in search of wealth and glory, Roger would eventually surpass the achievements of nearly every other Norman in history, equaling the status of the Duke of Normandy himself, and ultimately leading to the establishment of an independent kingdom in the south, one of the most prosperous and powerful in all of Europe. Like most figures from this period, we do not know when Roger was born, although it was likely sometime in the 1030s, when his brothers were already earning reputations for themselves on both sides of the European continent. In the mid-1057, Roger followed his brothers south in search of fortune. Upon arrival, Roger might have expected a warm welcome, but his brothers made it clear from the start that Roger had to make his own way in the world. Charity was not the Norman way, and there were no handouts. They probably didn't expect any either. However, over time, Roger proved himself to be a capable commander, and was accepted into the inner circle of his brother Robert Guiscard, who was then the most important Norman in Italy after defeating the Pope. And although he was just as ruthless in warfare as his brothers when necessary, Roger also demonstrated himself to be a master diplomat, usually inclined to avoid battle whenever possible. This thoughtful trait ultimately proved to be the decisive factor in his conquest of Sicily. By 1062, after living as a robber outside the castle at Scala for 5 years, Roger managed to position himself in a position of power and ultimately usefulness to Guiscard, to the point where they agreed to divide the newly conquered Calabrian territory equally. However, Roger was by no means content with just Calabria. He had greater ambitions. Just across the channel on the island of Sicily, this two-pronged assault continued relentlessly over the next decades, with Roger moving into Sicily and Robert continuing to conquer the mainland. Around this time, Judith Devereux, Roger's childhood sweetheart, and the very reason he came to Italy in the first place, arrived in the province with her father after he had fallen out of favor with Duke William. No longer a poor son of a lesser Norman family, the two were immediately married. One of the few happy marital arrangements in the history of medieval Europe. However, Roger had little time to enjoy marital life, almost immediately returning to his Sicilian campaign. By May 1061, Robert and Roger combined their forces to cross the channel to Sicily, not just to raid, but to establish a permanent base. At the time, the island was ruled by an Islamic dynasty called the Kalpads, whose ancestors had conquered their realm from the staging post of North Africa around 2 centuries earlier. However, its population was still mostly made up of Greek-speaking Christians, former subjects of the Byzantine Empire, but it was actually the North African Zirid dynasty, based in Tunis, where the Kalpads had first originated, that provided the impetus for the invasion. The relations between the two states had deteriorated over the years to the point of warfare, just as he had done with the Lombards before. Roger's aim was to exploit this disunity for his own benefit. With the help of his brother Robert, he was able to seize the important regional city of Messina on the north coast, which he would then use as a power base to launch continual raids and conquests deep into the interior. Over the following years, piece by piece, settlement by settlement, the island came under Norman control. However, from the beginning, it was clear that Roger would have to conduct the conquest mostly on his own. Robert had bigger fish to fry with his own conquest of Italy and his conflict with the Eastern Roman Empire, as he had his sights set on the imperial throne. Perhaps the most astonishing incident in Roger's life, and maybe even the whole Norman conquest of Italy, occurred in June 1063, when the Kalpads and the Zirids finally set aside their differences to cast out Roger and his Normans once and for all. At Sarami in the center of the island, a huge combined force potentially numbering in the tens of thousands, succeeded in catching Roger relatively unaware while on a raiding party, accompanied by only a few hundred heavy cavalry and a few hundred infantry. However, Roger's elite warriors, despite being outnumbered, lacked discipline and unity, being made up of two previously warring states. After a devastating customary Norman cavalry charge forced the attacking warriors back, Roger pushed on into the entire enemy army, causing it to rout in disarray and leading to massive casualties. The Battle of Sarami had the effect of fully establishing Roger as a legend in the eyes of his Norman kinsmen, and as a terrible foe to be reckoned with, as more and more Normans flocked to his cause. Roger increasingly found himself coming into contact with Greek-speaking Christian subjects as well as Muslims, rather than further inciting unrest and political instability in his newly conquered territories. He offered religious freedom to Sicilians, expertly implementing both Muslims and Orthodox Christians into his fledgling state. In 1072, this merging of cultures became even more pronounced when the important metropolis of Palermo was finally conquered again with the help of Robert Guiscard, who afterwards formally invested his brother as the Count of Sicily, a title preliminarily granted to him by the Pope years before. prior to any Catholic presence on the island. Though the arrangement between the two brothers also meant that Robert retained control of Palermo and various other Sicilian territories for the time being. Thus, for a time, it somewhat stifled Roger's campaigns, month by month, year by year. As more and more land came under Roger's control, more and more Normans flocked to join his cause, particularly after Robert's death in 1085, which meant Roger was now the foremost power in the south upon arrival in Sicily. These newcomers might have been shocked at first to see large numbers of Greek and Muslim soldiers, levied from the small folk now fighting for the Count, yet over time, these men would eventually become the backbone of the Sicilian army, as loyal as they come, bolstering and supporting the ever-present core of Norman heavy cavalry. In March 1086, the city of Syracuse finally surrendered, bringing tens if not hundreds of thousands of Greek, Berber, and Arabic people under Roger's rule again. He allowed these citizens to continue living much as they had before the conquest, provided they pledged their loyalty to him and his men, which they generally did unswervingly, largely due to Roger's reputation. Finally, in 1091, the last Arab stronghold of Noto yielded, bringing the entire island of Sicily under Norman control. Meanwhile, on the mainland, Robert didn't live to see his brother's success, dying in 1085 after completing his own conquest of Italy and moving onwards to the Balkan coastline to take on the Byzantine heartland, though Robert's illegitimate son Bohemond, who had been campaigning at his father's side at the time of his death, was the obvious choice to succeed him as Duke of Calabria and Apulia. Robert instead named his half-Lombard son Roger Borsa as his successor before his death, in an effort to fuse together the warring Lombard and Norman elements of his realm into one nation. The great Count supported his brother's wishes, pledging his service to Roger Borsa against Bohemond, perhaps realizing that the latter was a far more capable commander, and immediately set about ravaging his half-brother's lands. Of course, opportunity came, and the great Count's support was not entirely charitable. In return for military aid, Borsa was forced to cede control of various castles in Calabria as well as any claim on territory in Sicily, finally yielding his inheritance in Palermo to his uncle in 1091. As Bohemond continued to grow in power and renown, the conflict between the two brothers ultimately had the effect of cementing the great Count's vice grip over Sicily, further consolidating his position as the strongest Norman ruler in the region and his state the most powerful. In 1091, possibly in one of the most famous exploits of his long career, Roger amassed a large navy and set sail to conquer the island of Malta, ostensibly as a preventive measure against an Arab attack from North Africa. This would be the first instance of the Sicilian navy in action, a mainstay in the defense and offense of the island for centuries to come. Upon landing, the army encountered little resistance from the locals, and once they reached the capital of Medina, terms were discussed rather than swords drawn. According to historical sources, the conquest remained an entirely bloodless affair. The local leadership was allowed to retain its position in return for tributary status to Sicily. In one famous incident, large amounts of Christian prisoners were allegedly released from prison to the chants of Christian prayer, and some upon leaving Malta, the fleet apparently had so many new passengers that Roger's flagship nearly sank. Now, well over 3 decades after first arriving in Italy and politically supreme in Sicily, Roger had surpassed every other landless Norman knight in Europe. Not only had he achieved fame and fortune, but he was now the undisputed master of a vast, sprawling state made up of various different cultures and ethnicities. Roger was a better administrator than any of his brothers, and arguably even Duke William of Normandy, now King of England far to the north. Rather than allow regional lords a share in the power and thus threaten the stability of the state, Roger preferred to rule in an absolutist manner, unlike his brother and nephews in Italy and King William and his successors in England. No feudal revolt of any importance arose during his reign, as new Lombard and Norman settlers arrived in Sicily around the year 1100. Roman Catholicism gradually became the dominant religion, though Orthodox Christians and Muslims were allowed to continue practicing their faiths in the cities. Muslims retained their mosques, their freedom of trade, and their traditions. Likewise, Roger sponsored the construction of at least 12 Greek Orthodox monasteries, though in the countryside as everywhere else, Greek and Muslim peasants became serfs tied to the land. By the time of the siege of Capua, in 1098, Roger's army's composition had changed so much that when Saint Anselm visited his camp, he found the tents of the Arabs innumerable. Roger's relations with the various Muslim powers of the Western Mediterranean became so amicable largely due to the extremely lucrative trade links now opened with the relatively peaceful Fatimids of North Africa and the Middle East. Roger and his state remained neutral during the First Crusade. By the time of his death in 1101, Roger now presided over a multicultural powerhouse of a state, and one which would only grow in power over the coming decades. His successor, Roger II, born in 1095, just prior to his father's death, carried on the legacy of the great count, eventually succeeding in merging all of the Norman conquests in Italy and Sicily into a single kingdom, ruled over from his capital of Palermo, a huge metropolis. In the process, amazing artworks and feats of literacy were created. Its fleet dominated the eastern Mediterranean for decades. The kingdom of Sicily survived until the time of Napoleon. Some 7 centuries later, the legacy of Norman rule on the island can still be seen almost everywhere you look. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I've made many more from this same time period, and will be making many more in the future. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you made it this far, and check out my new channel, The Entire History of the Earth, which I've been making with my brother David at Voices of the Past. You can go watch the first 2 episodes now, and I'll see you on the next one.